All right, we good? The microphone on, we're good? Excellent. What a packed house. I love this. We're just talking about, I guess the Retired Officer Association is doing something downtown or whatever, and we should probably go with them drinking beers.
And there's a bourbon bar somewhere.
Could be a bourbon bar or something like that. I'll tell you, this is it's just a phenomenal panel. I know everyone says that, and I know that everyone says that, but it truly is. The years of service and expertise in the respective areas. And what I'm hoping for, and I think what we'll have, is some almost free play discussion on this. And I've been told that so that the Chinese can eavesdrop more easily, questions will be electronically submitted, so we'll get some of those up here. But I think a lot of the dynamism is going to be here on the stage. And there's no gotcha questions in this. There's no surprises. We've talked about the messages that really need to come through. They're all facts-based, experience-based, et cetera. And the theme here, we're going to start with General Heckle and talk about just the dynamic pace of innovation that's being seen as a threat in the operational environments. I mean, how do you stay ahead of that curve when it's spinning faster than I think we've ever seen in history, not to be overly descriptive of that. So we're going to go from that to the Navy side that loves the Marine Corps and how to best support fielding capabilities that enable U.S. forces to fight in the littorals. Congress is everybody's whipping boy because they write the checks, but they've got their own frustrations with the services when the requirements change all the time. And then at the end, after we get past Congressman Kelly, we're going to go to Mr. Bordelon with Bollinger Shipyards, talking really more from an industry perspective. You want me to bend metal and you want me to produce ships, but you can't settle on the requirement. The funding is volatile and irregular. So what is it that you're expecting from me, right? And the requirements change all the time. No wonder that we've got program delays that have been widely reported on. So I think that's the order we're going to go, right?
Sure.
We're going to General Heckle, Admiral Pitts, Congressman Kelly, and then Mr. Bordelon. And we'll kick it off with a few minutes and then engage in some discussion.
Sure. Yes, sir. Go.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so first of all, thanks to the Navy League for letting us be here. This is just a great forum, and just excited to be here. And thanks for everybody's attendance. Not everybody's heard me talk about the fact that I think this engagement with our industry partners, if I didn't know it before, in this job now going on 3 years, it is certainly vital to what we're doing. So I am the requirements officer for the Marine Corps. So I'm at the center of all things force design, have been for now going on 3 years. And I'm going to be very brief. I have comments that I wrote down. We clearly were mind melding before this event because in the green room here talking, they basically phrased up everything that I'm going to talk about here. So real quick, but it'll be fast. So we're going on, about to be in our 5th year of our force design journey. And I think when we started this thing back in 19, I don't think we fully appreciated the military technical revolution that was underway. And make no mistake about it, it was underway. But I will tell you that every month, every year that has passed, we have gained a more detailed understanding of the scope, scale, and magnitude of this revolution, which is why we have accelerated our modernization efforts within the Marine Corps these last few years, and we will continue. And it's been an attempt to stay in front of this really military technical revolution. And Dakota and I had a conversation about whether it's a revolution in military affairs. It's just a turn of phrase. But I'll simply say this. I found an Office of Net Assessment report from September of 2002 about, what was his name, Andrew Krepinovich. In September of 2002, he predicted what is happening right now in this Office of Net Assessment report. And he specifically talks about the military technical revolution that would take place. And he talks, these revolutions are typically characterized by technological change, systems evolution, operational innovation, and organizational adaptation. So think about how all that fits in with what's going on right now. And those 4 factors have driven our campaign of learning, the Marine Corps' campaign of learning, which drives all the adjustments that we've made in the past and the ones that we will make going forward. And typically these revolutions take time. And I go back to the relatively static positional warfare of World War I, kind of like what we talked about. Mm-hmm. And then you think about the evolution into the mechanized maneuver warfare of World War II. And that took a generation, more than a generation. And usually it's not just speed, but it's the magnitude of the revolution that is important. Now I want you to think about what's happening to us right now. It's both. To Dakota's point, the speed that this technology is evolving and changing the character of warfare literally by the minute. We're experiencing both. And when you think about the speed with which it's happening and what I see every day in this job, that compressed timeline is driving systems obsolescence. Representative Kelly in the green room talked about we field stuff and 6 months later it's obsolescent. So that is part of this military technical revolution, and all of that drives the imperative to remain agile in order to adapt and pace at scale, and to adapt at pace and scale in order to stay ahead of this unprecedented military technical revolution. And that's what we're doing in Force Design, and that's where we are now.
Well, I will have lots of questions for you here to elaborate on some ports. Then we've got Vice Admiral Pitts at N95, and if you could just kind of give us a couple of minutes of your view of all this mayhem.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Dakota. And thank you to the Navy League for putting on such a great event here at Sea Air Space this year. And I'm thrilled to be part of this panel. Mainly, part of the reason is besides the amphibious capabilities that we're such a strong supporter of, but this is a microcosm of a whole of government approach with the military, the requirements, the Congress, and the performers here. And I'm thrilled to be the N9 position player for the CNO and the SECNAV's team. The Marine Corps and the Navy amphibious capabilities have long played a central role in securing the global interests of our maritime nation. And today, the Navy and Marine Corps team and the Coast Guard continue that role operating far forward, around the world and around the clock, promoting prosperity and security, deterring aggression, and providing options to our nation's leaders. And this year's budget request and shipbuilding plan bolsters our investment in the Navy and Marine Corps team and our commitment to the Marine Corps' force design efforts that General Heckel just talked about, which focus on adapting to dynamics in the littoral. It maintains 31 amphibious ships in the FIDP and across the 30-year shipbuilding plan. It procures 3 LPDs and 1 LHA across this FIDP, and it funds 8 medium landing ships, providing maneuver and mobility to the stand-in force. I look forward to your questions, and thank you, sir.
Right. Congressman Kelly, Mississippi 3, right?
Mississippi 1.
Mississippi 1. I just got that wrong.
You ain't first, you last.
That's right. So yeah, from a congressional standpoint, right? I mean, you've got your own experience, but you have to work with colleagues on a regular basis, and the slings and arrows of changing requirements and funding and everything else.
Let me just say, if anybody's got Congress figured out, you're doing a lot better than me. And the majority of us understand that consistency and predictability of funding, on-time funding, is what's required in order for us to do defense. That's hard to do, and it's easier said than done. And there are a lot of wild card factors out there. So all you can do is the best job you ever do, and then take the message. But you guys have a large impact because you don't have to get me in the right spot. I'm already there. What I need you to do is help me get other members in the right spot so they understand how it impacts their district, how it impacts their constituents. I will say this, General Heckel, we are 100% in getting it wrong on what the next war will look like. Everybody throughout history has always thought the last war is going to be like the last war, or it will look like this in the future. The German Blitzkrieg in World War II, we weren't expecting all the aircraft and tanks and armored vehicles. We thought battleships would be the main warfare instrument in the Navy in World War II, but it turned out being carriers and amphibs, the ability to project forces. That's what it's about, but the principles of war are all the same. But what we've got to do is make sure that we're giving you as suppliers the ability to build a workforce, and that we're building the right things on time in the way that we say they are, and that you can rely on getting that paycheck so you can keep those suppliers happy so they can continue to do that. But we all know whatever happens, just like in Russia right now, Their wartime economy is kicking off. They're producing 155 rounds at a record rate because they've turned to a wartime economy. We're in a peacetime economy, but we have to at least build that industrial base so that we're prepared for tomorrow's war to produce whatever is necessary. But in the meantime, we have to have consistency and predictability.
That would seem to be a natural segue.
Yep.
The Bollinger Shipyards, led by Mr. Bordelon, this predictability, sustainability, stability, all those sorts of things, it makes it a little hard to produce a ship.
Yeah, Congressman definitely hit it on the head. Before I get started, I'm Ben Bordelon. I'm a president and CEO of Bollinger Shipyards. And I think it's just worth a second to talk about. I'm a third generation shipbuilder. My grandfather started our business simple times after World War II, and we evolved to now we have about 4,000 employees. Glad to be a part in Mississippi. A lot of different programs going on. Built a lot of different government contract ships over the years for different services. So we got to see firsthand the evolution of really where we are today, and how the bid process works, how it's changed, and some of the challenges that creates for the shipbuilder. And it's a lot of them because requirements do change. But you know, getting notice of bids years ago, literally you hear about it, and in some instances it might take 5 to 7 years to get an award of a government contract. And as was mentioned earlier, you have technology changes that are constantly happening. You have tweaks of the contract that are going on. And we're trying to, as a shipbuilder, give a clear design, give a clear production plan, engineering plan, as well as our supply base that we're trying to buy from. And then if you look back in recent history of record inflation issues that are happening, and I don't even want to talk about COVID because it's all mixed to me, that it's all part of the same, you know, really supply chain issues we've been having. But when you compound that with requirement changes that happen even during the bid process, and even last minute, it does create uncertainty for us as a shipbuilder. And it makes it more challenging for us from a cost standpoint, is one piece, and then a schedule standpoint's another one. And then you also compound that with congressional issues as far as funding goes. So how do we as shipbuilders in the supply base really plan for the next decades of shipbuilding without having that clear vision? And we understand it's hard, and we understand technology's changing and requirements change and conflicts change and pop up around the world in different areas. But then I think it also needs to be some consideration of, you know, what are the real requirements that you need? You know, I'm from South Louisiana, and too many cooks cooking a gumbo screws it up. At some point, my mom would take charge and say, "This is what we're putting in it." We'd like to see more of that, some more definitive happen during the process where we can have some clarity on the bid requirements and really where we're going to end up. Because again, if we started bid something 3 years ago, cost, and you look at it to today's world, it's a different world. And then you're trying to project out decades out into future pricing. And there's mechanisms that you use obviously in contracting that I must say protect yourself. They do and they don't. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And we've been stung both ways. So then you price risk into it, which creates more cost. And if your cost is too high, then you don't have enough funding. So I think that's some things to consider. Another one is, I think it's important to keep in mind, is cost realism. People understanding the requirements, having the capability to fully understand it and price it, and have the front end foresight to be able to really predict cost is I think something that has been lost a little bit. It's almost a race to the bottom. How cheap can we get on the front? And then all of a sudden we have a mess on our hands and we're dealing with contracts that need more funding after, and those type of things. That's another issue. And then one final thought before I end it is, you know, we also build a lot of commercial vessels. And in years past, there's been a mix of government type requirements, commercial requirements, and how can you blend some contracts, I think lead more towards mixing that. Some have had great success with that, but understanding the mission that, you know, the Marines and the Navy and being realistic about what they really need and what can you commercially get certainly affects not only price but schedule as well. When you start going all mil spec and having requirements that really limit your supply base, cost goes up and time goes out. That's kind of where it's at. So I'll be quiet, and I'm sure we have a lot of questions.
What I'm hearing on that side is the problem oftentimes is requirements, which you two are supposed to be generating, but the pace of change is such, from Ukrainian Franken missiles, being shot, either manned or unmanned, what have you, at Russian ships in the Black Sea, Houthis in Yemen with stuff supplied by Iran and others, at shipping in the Red Sea. So on the requirement side, Congressman, you had mentioned before about the frustration that can come from changing requirements when the requirements generators will come to you with different sorts of things every few months or twice a year, whatever that might be, and you're trying to convince your colleagues why something needs to be funding. And then on the shipbuilding side, once you've laid the keel and started bending metal, making adjustments or adding something to that platform that messes with its stability, right? How well it floats and moves can be problematic. So some quick comments on that. And then coming back to the requirement side is how do you deal with these ongoing assessments where something has changed, right? And you want to account for it because it plays into this idea of risk. And it's not so much the financial risk, but it's the attrition risk, right? The loss of a platform that now is possible that wasn't possible 6 months or a year or 2 years before, right? So there's this inclination to want to incorporate that into a revised requirements document that Congress then has to deal with in terms of funding, and the biller has to turn into reality. So if I could ask Congressman Kelly to kind of talk about that first, how that's handled on the industry side, and then the two of you to describe how you try to manage that in the discussion with your partners in resolving these friction points.
Well, first of all, I don't want to be like pessimistic, because let me tell you what, time and technology are equal opportunity offenders. They affect the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians or the Europeans. It doesn't matter. They equally affect everyone. And so I guess going back, I guess General Patton said, an 80% plan violently executed is better than a 100% plan after LD. So requirements are going to change, but I think once we get in the process, we have to build what we have. And technology is always going to catch up and surpass where we are. But I think we have to look at those. But the face of warfare has changed so much over time, from being a very centralized, you centralize to make firepower, to decentralizing. But what it does to them when you change requirements, it adds cost. And it takes suppliers and either makes them irrelevant now because we no longer need that supplier and he's got to get a new supplier. And it just becomes so burdensome that we wind up with nothing because we're always chasing that bright, shiny object that we're never going to catch. So at some point, I think you've got to commit. Now, if you, and if you're going to fail, fail fast. You can't take a long time to fail. You can't build something and get 80% through the production line and then say, hey, we need to change this, because then it costs a whole lot more if you can even fix it at that point. So
is there before we go to shipbuilding, is there a timeline on that? I mean, you're dealing in fiscal year cycles, right? So somebody comes in every 3 months. I mean, do you need a 2-year time horizon? And then we'll bounce that to Mr. Bordelon about how agile the industry is in adapting to this rapidly changing requirements process.
One of the things I push for is there's a reason we have a 30-year ship plan. And I think that the first, I don't know what the number is, it might be 5 years or 10 years, should be locked in. I don't think it should change, and only the 25 out years or the 20 out years change, because you can't, when you're building ships, when you're building large things or airplanes, you can't change that timeline. But we're on a 1-year NDAA process and a 1-year appropriation cycle. I wish it was 2, I wish it was a little longer. But once that NDAA is done, you may can change some of that in the appropriations process, but for the most part, don't tell me in March you have to have a system, and then in June, after the NDAA is complete, or July, and say, well, we no longer need that system, let's shift this to this. It just doesn't work. But it just puts our producers in such a hard place.
Yeah, and having, we can deal with change. Obviously, you know, we nimble enough that you can have change, depending on what it is. But as y'all know, change drives cost and it drives schedule. And you know, it's the domino effect, because if you change lead ship, second ship, and then that pushes to the right, then all your other ships push to the right, then you compounding the problem that we need more ships quicker and sooner. So I think managing that change is big. Sometimes you have change that's done after delivery. That's some things that we do, but identifying change early, and again, being realistic about the scope. I mean, that's another, I think, big push that I think understanding that requirement and really sitting down and coming up with a plan early is key. And at some point, you have to just call stop. You know, we get, and I'm sure there's foreign people in here, and we hearing the stuff about foreign shipyards and that kind of stuff. And I'm like to learn. I go around, and I'm not naive to think that we invented gumbo, for that matter. So we like to learn from different people. But some of the things that you learn in shipyards that are high efficient, putting out a lot of different products, they don't do change. You want to do change, you wait, and that's hard. It works, but being a little nimble, I think that it's proven that you need to be able to have that. But the earlier you can do it, and at some point you have to just say we're going to build these ships, and if you want to make changes later, we can do that in a future vessel.
May I make one more quick comment?
Okay.
But when you change those iterations, when the third generation of that ship or the third ship to come off, most of the parts have to work, because to maintain or to keep that ship running over time, and if it's so different from the first that the parts on the first don't fit the third, we lose suppliers from the first. So now we've got a ship that should last 20 years or 30 years, and now it only lasts 5 because the suppliers are out of business who are providing parts. So as much as you can, they still have to be interchangeable if you change the capability and capacity as much as possible. And we need to pay attention to, can we still fix that ship?
So in this campaign of learning, right, I mean, it's constant, right? It's iterative. You're always trying to adapt to the changing operational and threat environment. But at some point, is like appetite suppressant or something like that? I mean, they've got to be able to build something. So where do you account for that in the requirements process that then the Navy has to account for with Columbia and Ford class and new frigate and destroyers and everything else that compete for shipbuilding dollars?
Well, I think a lot of it starts with getting the requirement right out of the gate, and that should be looked. And I think maybe I'm partial, but I think the Marine Corps does a pretty good job of that. Partly because everything we do is working with the Navy, so we're the first. We've been joint our whole existence. So the commonality, the working across service lines, and now we've taken that to joint. But I think getting the requirement right is very important. And I think to what Representative Kelly's talking about a good bit is commonality. And I think we should take that farther to also view it from a perspective not just across the joint, but the coalition force. And I know Secretary Littorals has talked extensively about maritime statecraft. I think that's a brilliant way. So I think the requirement is first and foremost, right? But the requirement has to be pure, right? It can't be. I don't want a requirement that's fiscally constrained. I don't want a requirement that is I want the requirement as the requirements officer for the Marine Corps, and then we'll work from there. Then going forward, I will tell you that, and I think where the Marine Corps has done really, really well with the warfighting lab, we do very, very aggressive experimentation in S&T, and I think that informs. And you can't just view the requirement as like this. It goes through a process, and there are points along the requirements timeline where you can make small, refined inputs, which is exactly what, for instance, what we're doing with LSM. But once you start bending steel and metal, it's pins down, right? I think. Now, in some existential case, I guess there would be a situation where potentially you would have to recock. And so I wouldn't, I stay away from never and always, but so I think those are the best ways to do it. And I've watched over these past 3 years I've been in this job where we've been out and we've been doing a very aggressive experimentation, informed, S&T that feeds back into the campaign of learning and allows us to refine things going forward. And then I also think there's ways to offset some of these things later, once, for instance, when a platform's fielded through TTPs and other things. So I think I'll stop there if that answers. I'll pass it over to
Admiral Pitts.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's a fair assessment. We've been, I guess, the Navy in the past and the Marine Corps, but I won't speak for the Marine Corps. But the Navy in the past has changed some requirements in stride that have probably not been as successful as we would like them to. And I'll be the new guy here, right? I've been in the job for 3 months, so I can safely say I haven't changed any requirements since I've been in the job. Routinely, what we do is we work with industry up front as we're developing the warfighting requirements so that we do have a realistic idea that's pragmatic and we think we can deliver. And then we go through a series of analysis of alternatives and we study it in great detail before we finalize the final requirement for major shipbuilding programs. And my job as N9 is to absolutely minimize or zero those changes to the warfighting requirements. And then we work with the acquisition community who has to translate those warfighting requirements into ship design requirements and build the ship. And it is a team effort between the warfighting requirements side on the Navy staff and the Marine Corps staff and the acquisition side that's really producing the ship and working with the performer. I feel like we are giving a little bit better set of headlights through our 30-year shipbuilding plan that is much more aligned, at least definitely through the fit-up, as always, of these two alternatives. And for the next 10 years, it's fairly stable. But I agree, that is the mechanism to give those long-term headlights to industry. And those are major programs, but we're also flexible and agile for urgent requirements through our JUON and GEONS process and the fact that this year in the Navy, we've stood up the Disruptive Capabilities Office to look at those hard key operational problems where things are changing very rapidly for the fleet commanders so that we can develop a disruptive capability to fill a need and get it to them quickly within the next 18 to 24 months. So we use the process the right way, we minimize changes to the warfighting requirements, and we use a flexible process when it applies to get capability to the warfighter as quick as possible.
Well, Representative Kelly, General Heckel, and Admiral, they've all mentioned something about process, and it goes back then to at least a couple of the questions that have come in. Are there internal, bureaucracies are good, they're also a problem, right? They can be an impediment, but you need a process to work through to make sure that you get things right. Are there any kind of obstacles or impediments or bureaucratic things that need to be addressed to smooth this out, right? And then at the end, from the shipbuilding standpoint, is there a feedback mechanism that engages that process along the way, right? So we've got the fiscal process, we've got hearings, we've got the internal requirements generation. I know you two talk on an almost daily basis, outside of the normal formal chain of review. So if you could talk about the processes that are in place to determine what the pure requirement is, to then monetize that in some way, so you got a budget item, right? How it competes within the building, and then when you pass it to Congress, how that works, and if there are any oversight problems, right? I would say a problem, but it seems that every committee in Congress wants to have some kind of say about how federal dollars are spent, right? You have to account for that in some way as you're getting ready to submit your budget to Congress, so that it all works out. And then at the tail end, something's going to spit out on the shipbuilding side. Is there a way for the manufacturer supply base to feed back into that or to be accounted for in some way? So if you could kick that off with the Navy.
Yes, sir. So real quick, so I think are you talking about capabilities development or just the requirements process? So I think within the Marine Corps.
Well, they intersect.
Yep, they do. The capabilities development process, I think within the Marine Corps works quite well. We can always improve. There's always room for improvement, and we're always seeking self-improvement. I believe the requirements process works pretty well across the Joint Force. Having been a user in this process for decades now, I think it works pretty well, whether it's, going from a marine requirements oversight to the JROC. I think it's a good process. I think some areas where I think we've seen some progress is, we always talk about the valley of death, right? Because in that valley of death does matter to what we're talking about, right? Because we find things that could ameliorate an issue that we've identified that doesn't require bending steel or changing the whole form of a ship, that we could apply to a certain platform or to a situation. And I think between Replicator and Raider, I am pretty happy with where the Marine Corps is on that. And that is something that, 4 or 5 years ago did not exist. And I think we've seen some real fruits of that. And I'd say, Jimmy, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that.
No, I think you hit it right on the head. Use the process that we have. It's not that bad. It's good. But we are a continual learning organization that will work within it to make the changes necessary to help it run smoother. But it works.
Yeah, I think if there would be, and I would defer to the acquisition experts, but
Right.
if there were ways to and we all talk about the acquisition process, right? And that this industrial model of very linear and sequential thing doesn't. When we talk, that's why I started off talking about the military technical revolution. The speed of which, the scale and magnitude that it's moving is 100% incompatible with a slow, inagile process. So I want to be very clear, when we're talking about the requirements process, different from the acquisition process. There's an intersection there as well, but there's certainly room for improvement on the acquisition side.
So is Congress more of a help or a hurt?
Well,
Because sometimes you want to
I think-
oppose something.
I
But
think sometimes you said something, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, everyone, listen, we're not part of the funding process.
Yeah.
We are the funding process. We're not part. And so what I see sometimes is we work very well. All these guys are in my office all the time and from all aspects, and we're talking about. But when Congress makes a decision, you don't get to say, no, I don't like that. It doesn't work that way. Regardless, it's like being a parent. You tell your kids to do something, they don't say, I don't want to do that, and they don't get an explanation. So we're not always right, but we're not part of the funding process. We are the funding process. And so when we say do something, and then someone drags their feet and says, well, I'll show you, I'll just make sure this doesn't work, which happens, it's got to be in those conversations, and those conversations have to be made on the front end. Because the guys who suffer when we do that are these guys who build or maintain those platforms and systems. So I don't mean to sound harsh, but when we say we're going to go with this system and the Navy wants this system, then we're going with this system. And just saying, well, I'll break this system and make sure it doesn't work so that we get to this system doesn't work, and that puts them in a really bad place. So I think but I can tell you, very rarely does that happen. Most of the times we are sitting down on the front end, and where we disagree, we come to an agreement. And so all these meetings are had before hearings, and we know where we're going, and we just gotta, the acquisition process is made for, in my opinion, for the 1980s or 1990s, and we move so much faster. I don't think we need to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but we do have to be more agile in a changing environment that changes on a daily basis as opposed to a decade basis.
And I wasn't wanting to merge the requirement with the acquisition, but they do feed each other, right? Which then you have to deal with. And it's not just the spring testimony season, right? That these discussions go on all throughout the year. And so I'd ask Mr. Bordelon, I mean, is on the shipbuilding manufacturing side, part of this discussion, it's not just that you get the build order, when the check is being written, right? I mean, there is opportunity for the industrial aspect of this to be incorporated into both what the requirement needs to be, is it achievable or not, and then how the acquisition process translate that into a purchase order.
Yeah, it's a good point, because I do think that the evolution of the procurement strategy, investing in industry studies is smart. I think that's good insurance to buy on the front end to help vet the program and the process, help incorporate the requirements. I think you get multiple, capable people that are doing industry studies that, the government, Navy, Marines, whoever's the evaluator is getting a chance to see multiple, folks actually have input. Sometimes I wish I would take more of the advice that we give, but we understand that, I should say we don't understand all of the requirements, meaning we shouldn't. That's some of that stuff I respect from a secrecy standpoint. But we do tend to point out areas that, hey, if you really want this generator or you really want this, it's gonna cost. And those are some of the things that I think industry studies do bring out. If you do want to meet certain speeds or certain survivability, all of these different things that do drive cost and schedule, I think that helps. It gives hopefully a better, stable program. I know that's the intent. I would say getting stuff late in the game again hurts us as trying to prepare for building and pricing, because again, I said it earlier, the longer it takes for us, the more risk we have just based on time. And then the other big thing, the industrial base and the shipbuilding base gets hit on what can we deliver, what can we produce. If a schedule keeps slipping to the right on an award, I keep having to try to fill my gaps. I'm doing that right now in some of my different yards currently, where we trying to figure what gaps we're gonna fill, how we're gonna marry that over, and then are we gonna win, or we not gonna win, and then I get back to Congress, and then is it gonna get funded? But I do think from a positive standpoint, industry studies definitely, I think, add value to the procurement process, and predictability. And the more we do of that, I think you're going to have a better product at award.
So this is going to sound a little bit off track. It's not, but it's a tangential point. One of the questions that came in had to do with, are we better or worse than our competitors? And I'll throw in partners with that as well, right? So there's this idea that in an authoritarian model where you really have unitary control, like China, right? It's more, they can prioritize, they can resource allocate better, they can issue some kind of directive and everybody falls in line and does that. I don't know that that's entirely true, right? For all the frictions we'll have and complaints we have about our system, there's still an amazing amount of innovation, right? That you do have competition in the market space. You do have the ability to do this iterative threat assessment that goes on and feeds into that model. So I'm not sure who would be best positioned to comment on that, but the U.S. system versus Russia, Iran, China, other models, and then maybe how our partners are doing.
Well, I think the way we do it is far superior. I think that if you're bathing in your own bathwater, it's not a very healthy thing. So I don't think we do a very good job of self-assessment. I don't know that happens in the Chinese Communist Party, where you're directing a state-owned enterprise to do things, right? I don't think that's a healthy environment for innovation. I don't think it's a healthy environment to produce the things you need to produce. So I mean, I view that as one of their critical vulnerabilities, quite frankly.
I absolutely agree. I think there's a reason we're the most powerful nation in the history of the world. Right. And it's not because we do things wrong. And I think our system is the system. Is it pretty? No. Can it be really messy watching us make the sausage? But at the end of the day, I don't think they have any advantages. And even in numbers, they can build all the numbers they want, but I don't think they have the capability and capacity. And they sure don't have the warriors we have coming off the decks. They do not know how to fight wars. They do not know how to operate ships. Those things are easy to talk about. They're hard to do. It's easy to build an aircraft carrier. Not easy, but it's easier than it is to maintain that son of a gun and keeping it on the seas for 30 years. So I think we're far superior to our competitors. And even those, I think we work well with our partners. We learn from the Brits. We learn from the Australians. We learn from our partners. I think we share that. They don't share in their system. They only learn from their own mistakes, not other people's mistakes.
Well, with partners like Russia and Iran and North Korea, who needs enemies? I mean, our greatest asymmetric advantage for the U.S. are our allies and partners. And now 32 nations in NATO, we've added Finland and Sweden. I mean, it just keeps getting better. And we clearly, I will tell you, the Marine Corps, especially in this force design effort, we have learned so much from our allies and partners. Because there's a lot of things that are and now, like, they do things like we're trying to get into we're doing some small boat stuff, right? Multi-mission reconnaissance craft. The Brits and the Swedes have been doing that for years, right? We got a lot to learn, and we're learning. The CCP doesn't have that opportunity or advantage.
Well, it's a great straight man lead into one of the other questions here, and that had to do with this learning process, right? And you mentioned Finland and Sweden. We had in Norway on that, Poland on the south side. So this Baltic Sea is clearly a littoral sort of environment, right? So one of the questions again was two of them had to do with what lessons are being learned, right? So I mean, the theme of this particular panel had to do with warfighting capabilities in the littorals and how you go about doing that, how that translates into the types of platforms for fielding. So how do we define attritable? How do you define the threat environment, whether it's Red Sea, Black Sea, the Baltic, South China Sea, where the fighting is close in? I know that's what force design was looking at, multi-regional, right? Not just South China Sea, but these other areas as well. So what are we learning over the last few years as technology has really innovated? Unmanned systems, drones, cruise missiles, all that sort of stuff. And how does that feed into this requirement?
Well, yeah, we could be here talking about that, Dakota, till next week.
Right.
I mean, it's that broad. But I will just say that we started the force design journey in 2019. Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine on February 22nd of, was it 22nd? 2022. And immediately the Marine Corps fielded capabilities that we had started with force design in the high north with Task Force 61-2. And we were absolutely, lethality, we can reach out and kill stuff really good now. We can close kill webs and we're getting better now. But I think what we've realized through this journey, and particularly when you look at what we've learned through all our exercises with our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific to what we've been doing in the high north with Norway, now with Sweden and Finland, and as a former Chief of Staff of Strike Force NATO, very familiar with the Baltic and the Baltic nations, that our ability to sense, make sense, blind, and kill at scale and at will, we are there. And we have proven it in the high north, and we're going to continue to work with our allies and partners, and that's why we're trying to accelerate this. So I think all the things we've learned in force design are theater agnostic. And again, the reconnaissance, counter reconnaissance has really come to the fore with our understanding of the full value proposition of a stand-in force that we're providing for combatant commanders.
So on the shipbuilding side then, the Marine Corps talked a lot about LSM, right? LPD seems to be a really winning sort of program, but this idea of attrition, right? The attritable sort of aspects. I know CAPE has had a lot to say on ship survivability. That always leads to cost if you want redundancies in systems and the nature of the hull form and all those sorts of things. So this idea of distributed operations, smaller vessels, Wayne Hughes, God rest his soul, was huge on numbers, single purpose ships, distributed ops, salvo density, all those sorts of things. How should we view attrition and risk in the types of things that we request funding from Congress for? We had a little bit of discussion about IEDs and MRAPs. If the objective was to reduce casualties to zero, then I spend $1 million on a vehicle that has no other use but from getting point A to point B in Iraq, right? But it solves the problem of attrition without perhaps adding to mission success. So how do we translate this kind of dynamic of risk, attrition, survivability, in platform design as you engage Congress to get their okay on it, and then we give it as a requirement to the industry?
I trust the requirements coming from the people whose Marines or sailors they're required to protect, because nobody cares about them. So if the Marine Corps tells me this is what they need, and they need 100 not so survivable instruments as opposed to 3 that cost the same amount as the 100, that I trust them. And we don't need anyone coming over the top of those people who, once they have the requirements, let's go with those requirements. I go back to the Pentagon Wars, right? They wanted a recon vehicle. And the next thing we know, well, let's make it a little taller. Let's put tracks on it. Let's put a gun on it. Well, let's put a bigger gun on it. Well, let's make sure it can carry an infantry squad. I mean, you can keep adding things. You can keep improving your foxhole. But what we need is the foxhole. We need that 18 inches down there right now. If that's what the Marine Corps, they say, they want an 18-inch, they don't want overhead cover yet. We can get there at some point in time, but right now we need the capacity to get our warriors where we need them. And there's a survivability plus to having 100 targets as opposed to 3 really survivable targets. I'd rather have 100 a little less survivable because they can't acquiesce all 100 targets.
I mean, that's a different way of thinking, isn't it,
Yeah,
on the Navy
absolutely.
side? I mean, it'll pitch. I mean,
Yes. So our main operational concept in support of the National Defense Strategy and the Joint Warfighting concept is distributed maritime operations, where we have many forces distributed in the theater, executing kill webs from multi-domain, multi-axis fires or multi-domain, multi-axis effects that have balanced in there is I need to create the effect. I also need to be survivable on some, not as survivable on others. Generally, those not as survivable things are going to be more of your unmanned or smaller vessels, just like you mentioned, more of the smaller vessels that we can use. And you know, unfortunately, I can't go into a whole lot of detail at this classification level, but we have many capabilities and concepts in play that align directly to our distributed maritime operations, and that being our contribution to the joint force.
And I think the importance of the kill webs thing can't be overstated, right? So I use the example of, and I'm going to bring this back to allies and partners. In Project Convergence 21, we had no ally partner participation. New Zealand sent an observer. This last, most recent Project Convergence Capstone 4 concluded we had Five Eye and Japan. So I just want you to think about that for a second. And that's been less than 3 years. So the ability to close kill webs across allies and partners is really vital. And and understand, when you say close a kill web, that means you're feeding, it's this ecosystem, this mesh of networked, interconnected nodes that see a common operational picture, right? That is vital, right? Your situational awareness of the battle space is vital to survival and, more importantly, to killing what needs to be killed.
well, that gets to one of the other questions that have come in, and it talked about Peter Singer in a previous panel mentioning more, not necessarily better or, you know, multifunctional sort of things. This idea of numbers really does matter when attrition has become an issue. So it sounds like in distributed maritime operations, et cetera, that kind of thinking is really infusing the requirements generation process. I don't know how that translates into the shipbuilding side. You know, if the yards are configured for a fewer number, larger sorts of platforms, and then if the services come back with a more numerous number of smaller things, is the shipbuilding industry that adaptable that they can make those changes on short notice?
Yeah, I think one thing that shipbuilding industry has proven is we'll meet the demand. And I know we get chastised sometimes for not being there, but when you look at the history of shipbuilding in the United States, I think we've stepped up from an engineering standpoint, from a production standpoint, and also from a repair and maintenance and servicing. I know we need more, and there's talk about that. But one thing that I think is certain, you have seen consolidations happen around the United States and shipbuilding, and that gets back to stability, long-term programs, having some vision of where we're going. But I do think that having a different mix of ships is in this example, beneficial to shipbuilding. You're going to touch a lot more shipyards. It's not just going to be the big guys. It's going to be the second tiers like I am, and even below that. If you're building more smaller type vessels, you have the ability to have a bigger supply base. Now, with that comes different requirements. I'm working for the military, and there's an education that goes into that as far as getting up your staff. And my grandpa used to tease that he never wanted to do government contracting because you become sloppy and inefficient. He's kind of right to a degree, but in all seriousness, it is a different level from some of the smaller commercial type things. But you do have a bigger breadth of ability to draw different industrial bases into the shipbuilding community with the vessels you're talking about that are more numerical as opposed to high spec vessels. So I do think that's a big opportunity.
Can I think in the war on terror over the last 20 years, we use special operators to do things that any warrior could do. And we said they do it better. Well, absolutely they do it better. They're more highly trained. But we use them to do things that other warriors could do. And I wonder if in the industrial and the shipbuilding complex, there are certain tasks for the simpler things. We have people who can do that. So for the complex things that only Bollinger can do or only HII can do we let those, only the things that electric boat can do we do those things? Do we let them specialize and build those things that only they can do? And then for those other systems, do we spread that out and build a greater workforce where people get those jobs that maybe they're building something a little less technical, but I think we have to look at it like our special operators because there's only X amount. And if we overuse them doing things that someone else can do, I think we make a mistake. And I think that applies to suppliers all the way down the line.
I've got a couple more we'll try to squeeze in here before we run out of time. One of them has to do with the time horizon. So you talked about the adaptability, right, of shipbuilders over time and last 150 years and all that stuff. It's a great news story. But you can't change in 3 months, right? I mean, is there something that the requirements generators need to understand that, look, you got to give me 6 months heads up or a year notice, to account for congressional cycles and this campaign of learning and what the Navy's doing. What is your time horizon for incorporating in new requirements that you can adjust to respond to that?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. It depends on the change,
Sure.
Obviously. So it's definitely one where we need to consider the scope. We constantly having changes, smaller things, and that's not an issue. But when you're having a first-class ship, the sooner you can get it in, especially if you have a multi-run of vessels, if the longer you wait, you're affecting multiple vessels now. So I can't really give you a specific, I'd say, percentage per se. I think it's going to be we're going to have to evaluate as it goes. But I think what we need to do is continue to kind of scream on the hill is that the sooner the better. And then there is a tripping point where it's kind of too late. And that also goes from the production side, but the funding side too, where you have such a big change where, the price is a consideration, but also schedule, because then you start having schedule issues that really disrupt your whole operation facility. And I keep getting back to the supply base too, because, when we delay, it's not just my ship fitters and welders. We have the integrated bridge and weapons and everybody else that's associated with that ship, and then all of a sudden there's schedule delay there too. So I think the earlier the better. And again, I'm not opposed to waiting until after for some of this because in some instances it makes sense.
Final formal question, and I'll ask for some closing comments. So Representative Kelly and Admiral Pitts, one of the questions that did come in here had to do with really sustainability, right? Where in a distributed operations world with smaller vessels, there is a geography involved about where you port these things and how you get where you need to be and sustain over time. Part of this relates to U.S. flagged POL carriers, right? I mean, if our requirements are, from a U.S. standpoint, that you want to leverage U.S. flagged vessels for certain types of things, but the demand signal exceeds that, is there a legislative component to this where Congress is looking at the larger picture? And from the Navy standpoint, you got all these hulls in the water, and they got to be, the care and feeding of them in what can be very distributed theaters, becomes a problem. So a congressional standpoint and then a Navy standpoint, and then we'll go to some closing comments.
Yeah. I think as long as they meet the requirements, I don't think it matters. But sometimes if you have to change or modify a ship or a platform to meet that requirement, sometimes it costs almost as much as it does to build it from scratch. So I think going back to our commonality thing, if we want to keep those things sustainable, there has to be a commonality of parts within the ones we use or things that break. And listen, I think we've only touched the surface, and I know we're not talking about this, we don't have time to talk about this, but AI is going to be the answer of how we know when things are going to break and when we're going to need to replace things. So I think all those things, but from a congressional standpoint, we just want to know how much it costs and does it meet the requirements that are required, whether they be security or whether they be U.S. flagged, or do they have the capacity? All we care about is what the cost is and does it meet the requirements.
And from the warfighting requirement standpoint, as part of distributed maritime operations, we know we have to flow fuel, we have to flow weapons, we have to flow ammunition. So it's part of our contested logistics work we call it the 5 R's: revive, repair, refuel, rearm, and I think I probably said revive again. But anyway, so we have our TAOs and TAKEs, big ships that move all that to the major fleet. And one of our new ships that we're refining the requirements on is our next generation logistics ships, which are envisioned to be smaller and be able to move things in and out of the theater much quicker from the bigger ships or from a land-based a float pod or a shore pod. And we're still refining those requirements, but it still fits into distributed maritime operations. We're going to need some more ships that are a little bit smaller to move the fuel, to move weapons and ammunitions in a future combat scenario.
We've only got about a minute left for each of you. So any final comments, Mr. Bordelon, that from the industry standpoint, that you would want to wrap up or haven't said before? If not, fine, we can move on.
No, I just want to thanks for being a part of this panel, and I do think the communication amongst the industrial base and the government is key for us to continue to move forward, because having that predictability, us wanting to reinvest in our facilities, it's capital intensive. Shipbuilding is not cheap at all, and we're not subsidized, as everybody knows, and that's a big part for us to really evaluate. And when you have that stability and you see long-term programs, it's much more likely for us to invest a lot more money and capital into our not only facilities but workforce as well.
Got it. Congressman?
Just real quick, thank all the suppliers and shipbuilders, our Navy and Marine Corps partners. The synergy we build by these type of conversations, that's how we win. That's why we're the best. It doesn't matter if one of us gets it right, if the other three are wrong. It takes that synergy of all of us working together and getting to the right spot. But I still think we have the greatest system in the world.
Admiral?
So our expeditionary forces are the greatest expeditionary forces in the world right now. They are out there every day, around the world, around the clock, providing deterrence and campaigning for the United States. The Navy is in complete support of our amphibious partners. And as I talked about, we're proving that in our shipbuilding plan and our budget. And thank you for having me as a participant on this great panel. Thank you.
So a former acting commandant?
Yeah. Boy, you had to bring that up.
Yeah.
So, yeah, terrible. Hey, Dakota, thank you. And
Sure.
to the Navy League, again, these were great. And I'll echo what everybody said here. And just a great opportunity. These are truly, like Representative Kelly said, these are very, very helpful for us. Just like our trips down when we visit industry, it's just so helpful to walk the yard, to see the workers. Very, very helpful. And I will just say 100% what Jimmy Pitts just said. We have the greatest strategic maritime expeditionary force on the globe. There's no, think about Bougainville. It just got put in the water and we'll be taking delivery of her here soon. What other nation has the ability to ballast down, launch LCAC, LCU, and maybe some unknown things out of the well deck, while simultaneously launching 5th generation fighters, tilt rotors, and other unmanned systems off its flight deck simultaneously? Nobody. We can project power anywhere around the globe, kick anybody's ass, and we don't have to ask permission. So, totally agree. The Navy Marine Corps team bring a really, really unique capability that, you know, combatant commanders refer to as the Swiss Army knife, and we're proud of that. Thanks again, Dakota.
Well, thanks to our panelists. Thank you all for attending, and I look forward to some good feedback on that. Hopefully we provided some meat for you to chew on, and go back to your own respective sectors and then pummel Congress with all kinds of requests for support. And just God bless the shipbuilders and suppliers that
Amen.
make our military possible.
Amen.
Thank you, and we're right at time.